All right, I think we're ready to get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Black Experience in Economics webinar. First, what I want to do is give a special thanks to Dean Michelle Horath and the Harris School's Office of Diversity and Inclusion for planning this very timely event. Just as a reminder, there will be a Q&A. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. And if you require closed captioning, you should see a closed captioning button that you can press as well. So today we have a panel of very distinguished economists to discuss this issue surrounding the Black experience in economics. First, we have Sundile Hlatshwayo, who's an economist in the macro risk unit at the International Monetary Fund. Her primary work is about quantifying the domestic and international consequences of policy uncertainty through the use of machine learning and natural language processing techniques. Her work's been featured in The Economist, The New York Times, Financial Times, and The Washington Post. A second panelist is Professor Trayvon Logan, who's a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's held visiting appointments at Princeton University's Center for Health and Wellbeing and at the University of Michigan, where he was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Scholar in health policy research. Professor Logan specializes in economic history, economic demography, and applied microeconomics. And finally, we have Dr. Lisa Cook, who is a professor in the Department of Economics and in International Relations at Michigan State University. As the first Marshall Scholar from Spelman College, she received a Bachelor of Arts from Oxford University in philosophy, politics, and economics as well. She was a National Fellow at Stanford University and served in the White House as a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama. Her work is at the intersection of macroeconomics and economic history, with some recent work in African-American history and innovation economics. And finally, we have our very own Professor Demond Jones, who's an associate professor at the Harris School of Public Policy. He conducts research at the intersection of public finance, household finance, and behavioral economics. He's also served in the transition for Biden's administration, and I can personally say that he is one of the best mentors anyone could have. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Jones, who's going to moderate the discussion for the panel that we have today.
All right, thanks, David. I just want to give a shout out to David, one of our esteemed graduate students, been on the job market this year. He's making it. He's on his way out to start his career. So kudos to him. So thanks for joining us tonight, everyone in the audience and my fellow economists who have joined us here. We're just going to start off with some questions and some discussion. And so let me get right into it. I'll start off, Sandy, I'll start off with you and ask a question about Black economists and policy. So there's a lot of different ways Black people can have an effect on policy. There's many different channels. Is it important that we have a strong presence through the channel of being an economist? And if so, why?
Yeah, so thanks also, by the way, to the Harris School and to Don for having me. This is a really exciting event. So yeah, I'm a macroeconomist. I'm focused on drivers of big aggregates, right? So growth, inflation, employment. And what I've really come to realize over time is that it's not enough just to secure strong growth, right? A lot of countries can get bursts of strong growth for a few years at a time. But those same countries often also struggle with high rates of volatility around their growth. In one year, it's 6%, another year, it's negative 2%. And those swings are incredibly damaging to marginalized populations because these populations lack the sufficient economic buffers to navigate these rough waters. So marginalized groups are often the hardest hit in terms of employment and wealth, and they take the longest to recover. And that's led me and many, many others to shift our lens around growth. We don't just want growth, we want inclusive growth, we want resilient growth. And so how do you build in resiliency and inclusivity into something like growth? Well, you start by thinking about those marginalized groups, right? And how you can give them opportunities, not just to survive, but actually to thrive in an economy. And this benefits everybody in an entire society, right? And this has been pointed out by Lisa, by Raphael Bostek, by Janelle Jones, by many, many others. And this is why having Black economists in particular at the center of policy conversations is absolutely crucial. Unfortunately, we intimately actually understand the long list of ways that marginalization weighs on us and our broader communities, but we also have the toolkit to actually quantify its effects and define effective policies.
Great, great. Did anyone want to add to that? If not, I have another question to ask you guys. So Sandy Love was talking about the importance of having Black economists in that conversation, but oftentimes we face some obstacles in making it into this field and having success in this profession. Sometimes we face obstacles created by individuals. Other times there are institutional barriers that exist. Trevon, can you tell us how these institutional barriers sort of manifest themselves? And is it that these institutions just aren't paying attention? Are they well-intentioned, but maybe just not well-equipped? Or is it something else? Is it more intentional? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you for having me for this discussion, and being able to see all of you in this virtual format is always a good thing. I think when we think about structural issues, we have to think about how they interplay in the creation of someone as an economist who's going to be academically trained. So we have to think about structural inequalities that exist in the educational system first, but those structural inequalities that exist in the educational system in particular are also driven by larger social movements. So we know, for example, that to have the most likely path for a high impact career as an economist, one must be trained at a relatively small set of PhD institutions. But the people who feed into those institutions, even as we have diversified, say, the undergraduate student bodies at universities, we still have a segregation that exists that I believe is intentional, as we've defunded particularly public universities and defunded precipitously those who serve a larger number of first-generation students, students who are from non-traditional backgrounds, and students who are more likely to be racial and ethnic minorities. So when we think about that production process, those become structural barriers. That's not someone sitting in an economics department individually pushing buttons for American society, but these are structural issues that would lead someone not to be able to complete and have the type of career that they might desire. So that's one set of structural issues. And then we have to go into the profession itself. So say you've cleared those hurdles and now you're actually in a program and you're working and you're researching and you're learning about economics. We have to think about the questions that are considered quote unquote important questions among economists, who are a relatively homogeneous population, racially and socioeconomically, and even in their education background, versus questions that might be important to exactly the people I was referring to before, who come from those diverse backgrounds. And so there can be structural discouragement of researching and asking particular questions that one might be interested in. And then you might not be interested in economics if you're going into this discipline and you can't answer the questions that you want. You might choose another social science, you might choose to go to law, you might choose to go to business. And so these are some of the other issues that can take place. But I think it's very important to think about this as a system of a lot of different structural factors that can lead to the relative lack of diversity in our profession.
Thanks for that. Now, you all have overcome a lot of these barriers, but along the way, it might have been challenging. You might have hit some roadblocks. Lisa, maybe can you share with us, and I promise we're gonna take a more positive turn eventually, but this is a dismal science after all. So Lisa, were there any points during your career where maybe hit a roadblock or, felt like, okay, this is a big challenge here, a heavy lift to make it and keep, persisting within the profession of economics?
There was a time when that happened, and lucky for me, Planet Money picked up on this, and there are several podcasts about this. It took me 10 years to get a paper published, and in the process, I wrote several papers just to explain the kinds of questions that were being asked of by the reviewers, by the referees. And sometimes I thought that they were fairly fundamental questions. I was using fairly standard, though in some cases cutting edge tools that Jeffrey Wooldridge has been tweeting about in the last few days, but still cutting edge and fairly well known at the time. But those weren't the biggest questions. The questions were ones about American economic history. And it was really difficult because I think ultimately what was happening was that folks were asking me why African Americans would be relevant for the larger population. They're so different. They're so defective. Why would we be able to extrapolate something from that population to our general understanding of innovation and ultimately of economic growth and standards of living? Now, mind you, while I was getting those questions from referees and from editors, when I was giving the paper, who was typically asking me the most questions and keeping me afterwards and dominating the conversation over dinner? People from Russia, people from Ukraine, people from China, because this had to do with the rule of law and the scaffolding, the infrastructure that you need to achieve consistent economic growth that Sandila was just talking about. So I think that was the biggest barrier. And it turned out that our colleagues have some preferences that I didn't know about. Why would I call lynchings extrajudicial killings? Well, because they are. Why would I call them extra-legal killings? Because they kind of are, and I had to give many examples. I wrote, I'd say 2 or 3 books in the process of answering these referees and these referee reports. Some of them were turned into articles, and they turned out to be helpful complements, so that I had, say, a biographical article on Garrett Morgan, just to explain some of the things that I was talking about. But it was shocking to learn how little our colleagues know about this population. But if you compare that to how many people put the race variable in a regression or purport to study race in our profession, the two are just, they're non-overlapping sets. So it's really striking. So I had to do a lot of education, and I didn't think, I have a lot of friends who are in this profession, don't look like us. And I kept asking them, and I kept asking my advisors, like, is this a legitimate question? Is this person really asking what a former slave is? Like, is it a joke? Like, what's going on here? I really was asking genuinely for interpretation. So it was a bit of a shock. And I tell you, I was discouraged at several different points. I had Nobel laureates at the beginning of the research convincing me that this is absolutely top 5 journal research, and it's groundbreaking, and it should be published in a top 5 journal. And I, at the same time, was doing this mano-a-mano combat with our colleagues as referees. So I would say that this was a point at which I got stuck. And yes, you're right. We'll get to the point about this being a positive place to be. I didn't leave. So, that's a testament to these tools that I think are incredibly valuable and that can help people improve their lives. That's why I'm still here.
Thanks for sharing that. And just for the record, can you just briefly summarize, what was the paper on? Like, what did you find, like, just briefly, for people who don't know? What were you studying?
I was trying to figure out whether it was sufficient to have intellectual property rights protected to produce innovation. We heard Sandila talking about economic growth. Innovation is a critical input into productivity and economic growth to lead to higher living standards. So I was asking this question because what I noticed in writing my dissertation was that there wasn't the kind of innovation that one would have expected in Russia. And they had laws on the books to protect intellectual property rights. And I found an historical experiment that would be informative, that I thought would be informative. So I looked at African-American inventors and white inventors or non-Black inventors during the period 1870 to 1940. I looked at their patents to see what happened to patenting as a proxy for economic activity in this period, 1870 to 1940, where you had increasing lynching, racial massacres, and segregation laws. And what I saw was that all of these led to some sort of drop in patenting, and persistent drop, such that 1899 is still the per capita peak for African Americans for invention and innovation as measured by patent. So that's it in a nutshell.
Wow. Yeah, we'll see if we can find a link. We'll put the link in the chat for everyone to go read the paper, and also maybe that podcast. So I promised that it wouldn't all be dour. So I'm going to open up a question to all three of you. Can you tell me, and Lisa touched on this a little, how did you get into economics? Was there a specific event or experience or person or interaction, or when did you decide, okay, I'm going to go for it, I'm going to go into economics, get a PhD and things like that? Was there a moment, or memory that you have about that? Let me start with Trevon.
I guess I go by default. I did not intend to actually ever take an economics course, but I took one that was under a different title, and it was called African American Labor History, and it was taught by Herbert Hill, who had been at one point in his career the National Labor Director for the NAACP. And that was a course basically in Black economic history. It was a cross-sister course with the Department of African American Studies at Wisconsin and the Economics Department. And it led me to the things that I do now as an economic historian, because he just hated economists. He really did. And he talked about how horrible the work that they did in economic history actually was. I might have borrowed some of his biases because I moved into the field, but he really inspired me and told me that and I was talking in these conversations with him, probably the first person who, as a young student, as an undergraduate, that you really are excited by intellectually. And he encouraged me to take more economics courses, because he understood, as a traditionally trained historian and someone who worked in policy, that many of the tools that were being used were beyond anything he had been trained in. But he also understood the role, and what he would have called the outsized role, that economists play in shaping policy. And it was those two things together that I could marry my particular interest in history with a set of tools that could help to answer questions today that really excited me and led me on the road to economics. And so I'm always thinking about, for my own story, alternative pathways that we need to use to bring people into the profession. Because if you just take the Principles of Microeconomics course, typically, it's not the most exciting course that students take. It's a large service course. And the things that we do as economists are orders of magnitude more exciting than what happens there. And so I was afforded, by this fluke of this professor being here teaching this course, a different entree onto economics that immediately altered my perspective about what economists did and what economists could do and what I could do as an economist.
Great. Sandila, how about you? How did you get involved?
Sure. So my origin story, it really begins at birth. I was born and raised in Ohio, but I'm first gen. My dad is South African, my mother's Guyanese. And growing up, I spent, quite a few holidays either in South Africa or in Brooklyn, where most of my Guyanese family actually lived. And as a kid, I had like all of these questions about my little world, right? So it was, why is South Africa so different from Guyana, so different from the US? Within South Africa, why are some relatives living in mansions while other relatives are living in informal housing? Why did most of my Guyanese family choose to relocate to New York? And really at the core of all of these questions, and I didn't know at the time, the heart of my 10-year-old self's questions is really policy questions, right? Growth, inequality, migration, but the spark was lit at that time. And the same questions that I was asking really as a child are the same questions that I'm answering now as an international macroeconomist. And of course, there was many pivotal people along the way, Romy Tribble at Spelman, Peter Blair Henry at NYU Stern. But really the start was just this curiosity and all these unanswered questions about my life.
And how about you, Lisa? What was it for? Was there a moment or one of many moments? Or?
Okay, see, what had happened was that I was studying in Senegal, and I'd gone there to prepare a thesis in philosophy, particularly in African philosophy, because I was told that if I didn't prove that it could be done, I wouldn't get into a good philosophy program back in the US. That's what I was planning to do. And I'd already been accepted to do a PhD in mathematical logic at LSE. So I was carving out the concept of time in African philosophy to study, moved to Senegal. And I would say within the first week, I had a whole different set of questions. I paid $10 for a big pen that you typically pay 10 cents for in the US. And I could not understand what was going on around me. So I suspect that many of the questions that Sandila was asking herself when she was in South Africa, I was asking myself in Dakar. So anyway, at the end of the year, I'm completely confused. Like all of the questions that I want to answer are about fixed exchange rates, about internal devaluation, and so on. And I had math tools. I didn't have the vocabulary of economics. I had taken very few economics courses. I wound up climbing Kilimanjaro with this PhD Cambridge trained economist, and climbed to the first hut with him. And he gave me 5 hours of free advising. It was great. You need to be studying economics. Put behind you the philosophy and physics you started Spelman with. Put behind you the philosophy that you're trying to do, because these are the tools that you need to be able to answer the questions. It was fantastic. So I climbed down that hill and started taking the math courses I needed to take. And I think it was really important because these questions were ones that were just emerging organically, right? And I would say some of the ones related to time, that's what I was there to study, are still in the back of my head, and that may become papers later on. But it was complete serendipity that there was this intervention that gave me this path to follow with instructions about the courses I needed to take to be able to survive a PhD program.
So you would say you went up into a mountain and you came back down.
That's
with
right.
A tablet.
That's right. With a tablet. With a tablet. A little burning bush on the side.
So that shows you what it takes to get a Black economist into the field. It literally takes divine intervention. So we talked about institutions and barriers. This is a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek question, but I couldn't help but notice everyone here was at Berkeley, trained at Berkeley, UC Berkeley in the econ department. Is that by coincidence? Is that just a coincidence? Now, of course, I suggested names for tonight, and I went to Berkeley myself. But besides that, is that just a coincidence that we got a critical mass here?
Can I take a stab at that one first?
Sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
Berkeley was one of the earliest universities, the economics program, to host the AEA summer program. We're still trying to establish whether it was the first place to host the AEA summer program, but it was certainly one of the earliest. And it had a commitment to having at least one Black student per year. That was our experience that we've all talked about on Twitter and in other places. And I think that that has had a big effect on the signal that's being sent. This is the most popular place, the preferred place for AEA SP, for AEA summer program students. So I've been the director of that program at Michigan State for 5 years, and this is a preferred place for them to go. And there is a critical mass of them there now. They find support there. They find they find people who aren't talking deficits to them, but talking about possibilities. And it's often the case that underrepresented minority students are talked to about their deficits rather than the possibilities of the things they could study and the tools they could use. So I think that it's not a mistake. This has been absolutely deliberate. Other universities have tried this at different periods and given up for 2 years, 3 years, maybe 5 years, but then they have abandoned the project. But I think Berkeley has been absolutely consistent over the last at least 40 years in doing this.
And can you just, for the audience, what is the AEA summer program?
It is a program that is designed to encourage underrepresented minority students to do PhDs in economics and to prepare them to do PhDs in economics. And it's an 8-week program. It has been at Michigan State for 5 years, and it is moving to Howard University this summer. And it moves around the country. I did it when it was at Stanford.
Can I add on to the Berkeley answer?
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, Cal Econ is amazing. Speaking for myself, one of the reasons that I chose the program was actually because of the examples that everybody on this call set. There was clear evidence that Berkeley welcomed us and that they celebrated underrepresented graduate students. And also because of its strong reputation, of course, of the faculty being both brilliant as well as very accessible. And the department, I want to say, lived up to my really high expectations. I wasn't aware of this one per year rule. And I'll tell you a quick funny story. The first day of orientation, I'm sitting there and I see down the hall that there's another Black woman coming our direction. And I'm like, there's no way, right? We know our numbers in econ. There's just no way that this is really happening. So she walks in and I think we actually might've done a little dance, like me and Mary and Awad, because we were like, there's 2 of us. It's a miracle. And I just want to also, by the way, say in terms of coincidence, and it not really being a coincidence, is that Lisa and I also both went to Spelman. So,
Just for the record, we don't want to, I don't know if there's an official rule. We are not saying there's an official rule. There's people out here lurking in the bushes that may try to pounce on Berkeley. There's just there's a statistical
irregularity, right?
There's an interest in Black students at Berkeley. We'll just say that.
It could be, David, entirely endogenous. So my cohort had 2 African-American students as well, Andrea Can, who's now in the law school at UC Davis. And so a couple of things about Berkeley that I do think make Berkeley unique is Berkeley takes a very open-minded approach to economics, and just the range of what students in that graduate program are studying is just amazing. And there isn't a way in which it's not a factory of PhD production. And some other programs that I think very highly of really put a lot of effort into what I would call the polish that their students present. But Berkeley is really much more interested in the intellectual development of the students that they have. And I think that for whatever reason, that tends to attract a lot of African Americans to that program. And it's not important that they're admitted, it's more important that we finish, right? So I think you look at the completion rate for the African American economist at Berkeley, that is also high. Schools admit a lot of students, but what Berkeley does is it produces economists. And I think Berkeley's very humble. They really should say much more about that. I know one of the people in the participant group as I'm looking is my dissertation advisor. So they also don't ever leave, right? They're very much invested in the students that they have. And Lisa and I have talked particularly about the fact that the relationships that students develop with their faculty at Berkeley are long-lived. And that's another thing about forming a community, which is really important for anyone's intellectual growth and development, that Berkeley does. I don't even know if it's purposeful, but it's part of what it does as an intellectual community in that department.
And just for the record, Berkeley did not pay us to do this advertisement, but the point is that there are lessons for all these institutions that are trying to, be inclusive, that we have picked up from our experiences there. Okay, so shifting gears a little, talking about policy, because we are a policy school at Harris. Recently, Dr. Cecilia Rouse from Princeton was going to be the chair of the CEA, Council of Economic Advisors. And as I think was mentioned earlier, just for full disclosure, I worked with the Biden administration transition on their agency review team for that Council of Economic Advisors. And also Lisa, Dr. Cook has worked on their transition team, full disclosure. But in general, there have been some high profile Black economists, taking positions in the policy world. And so my question, Lisa, is this a trend? Have we seen improvements in this area? Are there increasing opportunities in policy work for Black economists?
I'm still pinching myself. There have only been 3 African Americans who have served at CEA in a senior role, in the Council of Economic Advisors in a senior role. And CC is one, Cecilia Rouse is one, I'm another, and the current provost of the University of Michigan is another. And it really seemed as though this is closed to many people. That's in the 50-year plus history of the Council of Economic Advisors. These are the advisors to the president. These are the ones who have the president's ear. So I took that indication to suggest that it's not that open, but we see in many different places people spanning out and having influence in many different realms of the federal government. And I think that's just amazing to have the first African-American woman chief economist at the Labor Department is just fantastic. And for her ideas, this is I think, even better thing, for our ideas to be taken seriously enough for her to be in that position. I think that is just, that's a real coup. So I think that there are impediments because this takes a lot of knowledge and networking. You've got to know to be able to be in a pool to be asked to do these kinds of jobs. So I think this is something that is incredible that is happening before us for CC to be in this position. And there may be some other announcements coming, but I think already it's just, I think, an amazing group.
Great. I wanted to piggyback off of that, Trevon, like that's in the policy world and then also in the economics in general, in academia, outside of academia. Two-parter, where do you see the trends going? Are we moving in a direction of more representation? And secondly, for everyone to jump in if they want, is representation enough? So this is a Black History Month panel. Does having more Black economists, does that automatically equate to better policies and outcomes for the Black community?
That's a very, I will be as concise as I can with that sort of two-part question. So first, let me put my dean hat on and think about where things are going in terms of trend, because that becomes an administrative issue about universities and the production of PhDs. That is one of the barriers to achieving a lot of the positions that we're talking about, although not exclusively. Although I know Sandili and Lisa won't say it, but Janelle Jones, who is the chief economist at the Department of Labor, is also a Spelmanite. So maybe there's something else going on in Atlanta. But in terms of what I see happening, so certainly universities, and Ohio State is one of them, are committing to increasing the diversity of faculty and also the diversity of their graduate student bodies. I think what is different about this wave of interest that we now see in in universities across the nation is that it is coming with a commitment to genuinely reflect on the culture of universities overall and the cultures of particular units or departments and disciplines that have had structural problems with diversity. I think that is a bit different. Universities in the past essentially incentivized poor behavior because if you weren't diverse, you could collect a lot of resources related to diversity, which actually is the last thing you want to do is to put resources into places that have not shown that they've done the very tough work of altering their cultures, becoming inclusive, et cetera. So I do think we might see on the other end of that greater production of African-American economists. But another issue that is, I think, equally important to that is who are these people who will be created with this production process? Is representation enough? I don't think that representation in and of itself is enough, particularly if it's ornamental. And if representation means that the person who is this representative is not bringing anything that is generative to their holding of a particular position, whether that be a faculty position, a position in government, et cetera. We should want to have African-American economists in places to give voice to issues that are not currently highlighted by the people who are currently sitting at the table. In other words, bringing another person to the table who's going to say the same thing that everyone else there is already saying is adding to the numbers, but it's not adding to the discussion. And so I do think it's important that we have people who are informed by these perspectives. And that's why I think the educational process itself is important, because the questions that we ask, going back to Lisa's discussion about sort of patents and the work that she was doing there, these questions that we're asking and answering in our research are different and therefore can alter the perspective that all of our students are bringing to the table, right? And so that's where representation can really matter. If it is generative to asking a new range of questions and bringing new perspectives in to those standard operating procedures.
Sandula, so going backwards now, we're at the end, like where do people end up in their career? Are they in government? Let's go back because I know some people have some questions just to start off. What's some advice you would give to young Black students who might want to go into economics?
So it's a tough question just because we're aware of all of the difficulties, right, within the profession. I often struggle with what advice to pass on to my mentees, many of whom are women of color. I adore econ, and I've had a really positive experience, writ large. However, I've also seen others really navigate dizzying, bias-tainted labyrinths that encourage them either to leave the discipline behind or that despite their best efforts, they're excluded because they lack the network, for instance, that comes with attending an elite program. Now, would I do it all over again? Absolutely, yes. Do I consider myself, though, to be extremely lucky to have avoided some of those pitfalls and doom loops that others have? Absolutely as well. However, there's a lot of ways to avoid those pitfalls, including by choosing environments, like Berkeley, like Spelman, places that want you there, that will celebrate you. And then finally, to borrow from Dambisa Moyo, I think it's really important for students to really have a boardroom of mentors. It's not just about one person. Your group of mentors should really be as diverse as your needs are. So I have someone that I go to for advice on research. I have somebody for internal work politics at the fund. I have somebody else that just reminds me of my broader narrative. So, sometimes you lose sight of the journey, but I have that someone say, what you have now is what you asked for 8 years ago.
Great, and so we're almost ready for Q&A. I just want to do one last question before we open it up to the audience. In talking about making it through, getting into the field, the network that you need, can you guys just briefly touch on what have Black economists done to carve out a space for themselves in this field? What are some of the strategies that they've used collectively to try to open up doors?
I'll talk about one that has been really important lately, and that is in an era of social media um, and really on the ground organizing, and that's the Sadie Collective. I think that these young women, this is an organization of young women who are informing themselves about the opportunities in economics and related fields. And what they noticed is what I noticed about the AEA summer program, that there just weren't any Black women in the program. So I started recruiting Black women into the program and making sure that they participated in a way. And at the same time, we saw numbers of African American women getting PhDs in economics declining and in BAs in economics declining. And there wasn't anyone doing anything about it. So I am just ecstatic that this grassroots organization has taken off and named itself after Sadie T. Moselle Alexander, who is the first African American to receive a PhD in economics and who happens to be a woman. I think it's one of the great examples of the support, the networks that one needs to survive in this field.
We can let's go. Maybe we can go to Q&A. Michelle, should I do it? Or are you gonna ask the question? You can do it. All right.
Yes. Good
Okay,
evening,
great.
everyone. I feel like I'm Zoom bombing, but I promise that I am not. I am going to facilitate the Q&A because Damon, I know that the audience members also want to hear from you and get your perspective as well. So we have so many great questions, and unfortunately, I don't think that we will be able to get to them all, but we will try. So the first one, how can economics instructors alter the content and approach of our courses to be more inclusive of African American perspectives and students?
I can, I'll just point out real quickly, there was an award that was given to the University of Missouri economics department recently. And I think there's two things about why they won that award that might be useful. One is that in their intro class, what they would do is bring in speakers, and they would bring in a diverse set of speakers. So I know like Trevon went there, I went there. I don't know if anyone else on the panel went there. Lisa, did you go? And so they brought in a diverse set of economists to come and talk about their experience to like the intro class. And that's probably where there's gonna be a drop off, you know, in students, the Black students and other marginalized groups. So importantly, and not to like be self-promotional, they also compensated us for that extra labor to come and, you know, do this service. So for you universities that want to increase diversity, that you're asking for people to do labor, so compensate them for that. But that I think added might have been able to hook some people. And in general, I think in those intro classes, we talk about widgets and abstract concepts. And if you can just say, you know, at the end of the tunnel, people are doing research on patents and lynchings, or people are doing research on, they're using machine learning to look through news articles and headlines to measure risk and policy uncertainty, or they are looking at the patterns in the names that Black people chose historically and the reasons why they might have done that, which is some of the research that people on the panel are doing. If they knew that you could do all of that with economics, then I think that's one thing that'll keep people in a little longer.
And that award, because I'm on the American Economic Association Executive Committee, I have to say that that was actually an award that was created by the American Economic Association. It's come a long way. This association is really evolving.
Okay. Let's see. Given the recent growth in consciousness surrounding the strength of the Black dollar, what are some opportunities or challenges that you have seen on the economic side?
Let's see how we answer that.
All I'll say is
Yeah.
I'm not the macroeconomist, so I certainly will defer.
That's a micro issue. That's about firms. That's a micro issue. That's why Sandila and
I'll
I
say-
are
I'll say this.
confused.
That is
I'll say this.
it's a
I
macro.
will say, you know, I'll try to take a swing at this. So one thing that is true is that especially during a recession like which we're in, one macroeconomic, so the theory is that if we put money in people's pockets, it gives them relief, it gives them income support, it allows them to meet their needs, and there's an additional benefit, which is that if they spend this money, it can like boost the economy. So there are policies like the minimum wage, like guaranteed income policies, extending unemployment insurance. These are policies that are often, cast as, just welfare handouts. People don't like them, they racialize them, they talk ill of them. One thing that we fail to mention is that, and this is disproportionately going to affect Black communities, is that will in turn generate spending that could, also have a positive effect on the local economy. And so, that's yet another motivation or justification for these types of policies, and it's often overlooked.
And Damon, people would like to know sort of what got you interested in the field of economics? Sort of what is your story?
Okay, so there are a number of points, but one interesting thing that happened was when I was about to graduate undergrad, I had a background in public policy major, but I was good at math. I was being encouraged to go into graduate school to get a doctorate. I was choosing between political science and economics, and I figured that I didn't want to go a quantitative path. I wanted to do poli-sci. For some reason, I thought like, okay, I could, I thought that numbers were more removed for people or something like that. And I had an advisor that, thought differently, and he really pushed my buttons and manipulated me. So he said, I told him, I've thought about it. I think I'm going into political science. He said, come and meet me on campus this afternoon. I just need to talk to you for like 10 minutes. We met, and he said, this is around 2000. He said, there's all this discussion about reparations. And he said, are you going to let white people do these calculations about what the reparations should be? Who's going to do it? And then I was like, you got me. You got a good point. So I think his point was that having a quantitative background was unique, and being interested in social science was unique. And he wanted me to go in economics because that's a path that wasn't everybody could take. So he pushed my buttons, and that was part of the reason why.
Let's see. How related is the failure of economics to consider Black perspectives in policy and research related to the general lack of emphasis on any sort of economic history at all in PhD programs? And do you see this as moving in the right direction in the field, or stagnating, or getting worse?
The economic historian should definitely take this one.
Lisa? So I will say again, Berkeley has economic history, so that's not a problem in all of the PhD programs. But I do think that economic history has moved more outside of the core training of a PhD economist. And equally important, and this is something that actually that I'm thinking about a lot because I'm teaching American economic history this term, and I'm right in the depths of talking about antebellum enslavement. And so the perspective that economists have brought to historical topics has not always been informed by considering racial analysis. I think one of the biggest challenges that we face as a discipline in terms of being able to speak about issues of race in general is that we have viewed race as a social identity as opposed to a political identity. Race is inherently tied up into the way that we distribute and allocate resources in our society. And race itself is the product of, not a precursor to racism. And so when you take that historical approach and reorient the way that we think about race and racial analysis. But that is a heavy lift for economists who have concentrated on technical skills, but would still need to do a lot of other training in other disciplines like sociology, like history, like political science, to fully understand the economic import of that sort of orientation. There are economists, people like Sandy Darity, Derek Hamilton, who are working on stratification economics, who are taking those perspectives in, and they're beginning, finally, as I say, someone who's seen this over 20 years, to generate more attention into the mainstream of the profession. But it is it's a long way from just adding race variables in analysis to really thinking productively and really critically about the way that race functions in our political economy. But that's inherently a historical analysis.
And I'll just add another perspective. As a macroeconomist, I was teaching macro in fall 2008 in Michigan, when all the bad data were showing up. And I jettisoned the last quarter of the syllabus to teach economic history because our macro models weren't working. And then, so that's one argument for teaching more history, because when we stop understanding how economic variables are related, we really do need to resort to history. But the second thing is, I have used history, as I mentioned in explaining my paper. I used historical examples, and our colleagues don't know them. And I think this is a common understanding that one should have in one's economic training. We've been fortunate in that economic history was offered at Berkeley. And I think that all economists should know this, and they should know the African American contribution to that history, since it is Black History Month. Because like I said, I was kind of shocked at the lack of knowledge of African Americans generally as they move through American history.
So staying a little bit on this thing, there was a question that was also sort of related to this, but speaking more of going back to what's happening in the classrooms with students, across the country who are taking these courses. How would you encourage your colleagues to value this historical piece that you are speaking of, and how do you encourage your colleagues to change the way that race is discussed in classes and provide this rich context in order for students to get a true appreciation for the role of African Americans in economic history?
Well, I think the first would be to talk about race at all, which is something that economists really have not been doing. If you're thinking about, you can take an entire introductory sequence, say in Principles of Micro and Macroeconomics, concentrated on America and the micro and the macro, and not talk about race, not for 1 second, right? So part of it would be discussing race, and not thinking of only discussing race in terms of, say, labor market discrimination, right? But taking race and putting it into the other places in which it is important in our society, which is literally everywhere. If we're talking about gender, for example, we should also be talking about race, right? Because we're erasing these experiences, say, of Black women in the economy, who have a very particular history in terms of higher rates of labor force participation, for example. Those are unique aspects that need to be discussed when we're talking about those topics. So I think the first thing is to open up the doors of discussion about race at all, and then moving it into further, how do we have and analyze race as something that is of economic import, which it certainly obviously is, but then how do we think about that as economists? How do we think about that theoretically, methodologically? How do we think about that in applied work? That's the next step. But first, it's really to engage in that conversation. I think the profession and Lisa's work on the executive committee of the AEA is important here. Admitted in 2020 that they really just have not been really thinking about race as a substantive area in economics. This is in the year 2020, right? This is an admission that the profession has really neglected to think about these issues critically. So then what can we bring to the table as a profession when the nation is crying out for solutions to racial inequality? an economist, largely the mainstream of the profession to be sure, is essentially flat-footed.
Can I add just also, in addition to what Trevon said, like on this panel, like two people on this panel, like Lisa and Trevon, have written primers on race and economic history for certain institutions like the Economics for Inclusive Prosperity. They have a piece that they wrote, and it's like a entree for people to learn about race. So the one thing that Trevon says is we could talk more about race. I would be cautious to just encourage my colleagues to just start talking about race, because they may say some things, Black enrollment could go down to zero quick. So we need to have a foundation, like Trevon said, foundation in thinking about race as a social construct and things like that. Now, I think there are ways that people need to, like Trevon said, is like they need to learn from other disciplines, history, sociology, and other things about race that could improve the research that people are doing. The people who are best positioned to do that also have a limited amount of time, and they're not here to just, do this for free. So, we are a field of economics. They would need to be an investment in this. To have people who are skilled and can do this, we talk about incentives in economics. So you would need to give people an incentive to spend their time from their research and their teaching and their lives to teach their colleagues. So, put some money behind it, put some resources behind it to really set up a way for economists. So what they do with the AEAs, for example, they have like continued learning for economists. Do you want to learn the newest econometric tools? Do you want to learn the newest tools in machine learning? Put some resources behind continuing learning for economists in topics of race and history.
Yeah, if I can add just one more thing to that. I think the confluence really of Black Lives Matter with social media growth, with, actually advances in our ability to pull together really large data sets quite quickly using web scraping and, other technologies, has led to this moment wherein discrimination and race-related issue can no longer be swept under the rug. So you have, evidence that already existed that's also growing quite quickly, and people are now increasingly talking about that evidence. And of course, now money is responding, even if it's on the margin at all of these institutions. And it's forcing these institutions really to show progress rather than just promising to think about it in their next 10-year review or something. We're really in an era of show, don't tell. And that's not only just on hiring and recruitment, that's also in terms of the topics covered in classes. So I think that there's going to be this natural progression over time in response to growing demand for these subjects to be covered.
And if I can add just one thing, I think in my covering macro, teaching macro or taking macro, I think that there has been this thought that these are completely opposite issues, race and these major variables, these macroeconomic variables, say monetary policy, let's just take that example. And what we know is that there is race inherent in monetary policy, in bank lending, for example. I mean, also in bank lending, which is not monetary policy. So what I would like, not only for us to think more about race, but to make sure that it's not just in the places where we typically find it, in labor, or we would expect to find it, labor, economic history, public finance, in macroeconomics as well. And we can no longer deny it for the reasons that Sandila is talking about. This is absolutely important, that distributional considerations are absolutely important. And I don't think we can unsee this after what has happened, especially in the last year, if not in the last 2 or 3 years in economics.
If I could just add one more thing that I think is so important, what Lisa just said, to think that there are racial wealth implications to monetary policy as well, not just the short run effects on employment. And so all of these things are tied together that we want to talk about: racial wealth inequality, employment inequality for African Americans, right, that are influenced by macroeconomic policies such as monetary policy. And so without thinking through then what this does in an economy that has inherent levels of racial inequality, we're not even doing the appropriate policy analysis to exclude race from those discussions. So it's even more important to include them to make sure that the analysis that we're doing of policy, which would lead to policy prescriptions and design, is appropriate, just as Lisa said.
Okay, you know, we just have so many awesome questions remaining, but I want to be very respectful of everyone's time. I do want to just toss in one more question. There are certainly a lot of students at Harris. There are questions in the Q&A that relate to this, but you know, I think students, you know, people in general are interested in, you know, understanding, you know, why is there a pipeline problem? What can we do to get more people of color interested in the field of economics? You know, we've talked a lot about sort of the impact of not having more people of color, but, you know, assuming that people feel like there are these deterrents or a lot of barriers to entry into this field, what advice can you give to students who are listening in, who are thinking about economics, but are a little bit hesitant because of all of the barriers?
I would say, because I teach undergraduate courses sometimes, that students should inquire about research opportunities. What we're finding in economics is that this is becoming a defining feature of the path. And I would argue that you can start as early as you'd like. There are often undergraduate research opportunities, but you can also ask your professor if that professor needs an RA. And that word doesn't often get out. It doesn't get around often. So I think that's one of the parts of the hidden curriculum that students can actually do. And, you know, I always had students from freshman year to senior year as RAs during my time in academia. So I think that's one of the things that one can do. But if I can add something, our students shouldn't be responsible for this. We should respond to our students' emails, to underrepresented minorities' emails when they write us and ask us about doing research. Because we know that when they are asked, professors are asked about pathways to PhDs, that women and underrepresented minorities are the ones whose emails are not answered. So there is something that we can do to be more responsive, to take underrepresented minority students more seriously. So I think it works both ways.
I would also just say we can increase the flow in the pipeline. We know different ways to do that, but people aren't going to stay in the field if it's not welcoming, if it's not inclusive. So it's almost like a catch-22 to push someone into this environment if it's gonna, you know, if it's not gonna be, you know, inclusive. It's going to be hostile. So that needs to change along or before the pipeline can really have those payoffs. So yeah, there's one more thing I was gonna say. So there's definitely that, and I think I forgot the other solution. So that's the only solution I can get there. I'll let someone else go. It may come back.
So I'm glad that Lisa mentioned the hidden curriculum, because I think that that's such an important element of answering this question. You know, I've met straight A undergrads that never ever went to office hours to get to know their professors. And so then the time comes to ask for a recommendation, and all they can say is, you got an A in their class. You know, and then sometimes you have people going into graduate programs and they try and complete that first year of coursework on their own. These programs are not designed for you to do this on your own. And in fact, you're a much better economist at the end if you get to know your peers really during that deep bonding time over problem sets during that first year. You know, and then finally, going along the pipeline, you know, in my mind, I don't think it's commonly known that, you know, when you're on the market or when you're a junior scholar, your ability to tell a compelling story about your research is often as important as the research itself. And, you know, you can't just be smart, you have to be persuasive. And so I would say, you know, again, on our side as, you know, the institutions, as the people that have come before you, is that we just need to make sure that we share this knowledge far more widely, because what's obvious to us is not obvious to people coming into the profession.
Oh, I know what the other solution I was going to add was, which is that until the profession meets its like requirements or responsibility to be as inclusive as possible, you are going to need to draw from outside of your local, like your most proximal set of resources, your local department, major institution. Even when I was in grad school, I had to meet people at conferences that were, you know, targeted to people like me. And make those connections outside of my institution. I had to supplement what was provided to me within my institution. And so in the meantime, that is, I think, another key thing is that you have to try to tap into these networks, for example, networks of Black economists of various sorts, to get like that external support while you're working your way through your local institution.
Okay. So I think, unfortunately, that is all that we have time for. But I would like to say we would absolutely love to have the opportunity to have all of you come back into the Harris space. It's unfortunate that this has to be remote because I can imagine what the energy in the room would have been like if we were all in person. And, you know, so we have to do this again. And Sandile, we didn't get the chance to talk about any of this from an international perspective. And I know that students are absolutely interested in that. I will say, you know, on behalf of the Harris School of Public Policy, we absolutely thank all of you for giving your time to us this evening. I think I mentioned this comment to you all before we went live, but we started this month having a conversation with Black mayors across the country, having a really candid conversation about where are we and how do we move forward. And these are, you know, mayors who were, you know, in Gary and in Philadelphia and in Birmingham, Alabama. And so to talk to the mayor, you know, young African-American male mayor about what is it like to be in the birthplace of the civil rights movement, like right now, leading that city forward. And this has been a beautiful way for us to end our celebration of Black History Month with amazing economists who come from all over, and you all have inspired us tremendously. And I hope that we continue this conversation within the Harris School, but also just throughout the University of Chicago and other institutions across the country, because it is very timely. It is very, very timely. So I just want to thank all of you again. And for those of you who have tuned in, I do want to mention that we have a Harris After Hours. The link is in the chat box. You are more than welcome to join us. We have a spoken word artist who will be joining us from Chicago this evening. So again, thank you on behalf of Harris. So have a wonderful evening. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for
This has
having
been
us.
excellent. Thank you.